Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this training on how to break bad news to your client in a community legal clinic setting. To start off, we are going to be covering some of these topics in the course of this training. We'll do an overview on what the bad news can look like, what are some things you should consider when delivering bad news, what are some of the critical steps to breaking bad news to clients, some caveats depending on the context of the situation, and some safety and other tips to help in the process of breaking bad news. So, we might ask, what does the bad news generally look like? Usually, it'll be one of these things. The case didn't go quite as you had planned, or you are already foreseeing that things will not go your way. So, if you already know the bad news or expecting to receive bad news, it is good to have a strategy on how to deliver this information to your client. Some things to consider before we get into the nitty-gritty. What is the biggest issue? Who is the person receiving the news? Is it more than one person? Who do you expect will have more difficulty processing and accepting the news? When and where are you delivering the bad news? And how are you wording the information? How are you delivering the bad news? In what ways are you uh, explaining the news to your client? So, very important to remember before we get into more depth. You want to have empathy, but be resolved in your goal of expressing the crucial information that your client should be privy to. You don't want to sugarcoat or downplay it, and don't make promises that you can't keep. So, if the news is really bad and there's really nothing that can be done, don't say, but there's a way that we can mitigate it, because if there really isn't, you don't want to sugarcoat to make the receiving of the news easier in the moment and then later make more trouble for yourself. So if there's no way to mitigate, there's no way to make it better, don't promise things that you can't deliver. Just be very direct, be empathic, but don't skirt around the most important thing that you need to communicate to your client about what happened with their case with regards to a decision or a ruling or whatever it is. So, when looking at delivering bad news, there are generally three main steps, and some of you might already be familiar with this process. We are going to delve deeper into these steps as we move through the presentation. But the first step is prefacing the news, number two is delivering the actual news, and number three is expanding on what that means for the client and how they have received the news, how they're processing it. So, for step one, prefacing the news. When you're getting ready to deliver news that the client won't love to hear, obviously, you want to be sure that the client mentally is preparing to hear it. So, how can you preface the news? What can you say beforehand that would help the client prepare for the news? There's an example here on the screen. We've been waiting for them to respond to our request, and this morning we got an update. Unfortunately, it seems that they did not accept or did not see things our way. This is a very direct way of preparing the client to hear what they have to hear. Because again, you don't want to sugarcoat it, but you also don't want to be too blunt or too dramatic in the process of delivering said news. So you want to make sure that you're being empathic, that you're respectful of the client, and that you're also setting up the conversation to say, this was our goal, this is when we were hoping to hear about it. We've finally been told, or they've reached a decision, and unfortunately, things are not the way that we expected them to go. So, you haven't delivered the news yet, but the client is preparing now mentally and emotionally to hear something that they don't really want to hear. These are some things that you can consider while in the process of forecasting the news. First thing you want to do is pause. And this is even before the prefacing to the client. How are you feeling as the student attorney about what you know, about the information that you've received about a certain case? You want to be very clear and honest with yourself about what you're experiencing. If you are upset for the client, if you're sad, if you have any kind of reaction emotionally or mentally, if you're afraid, things like that, you don't want to stuff these feelings down. Because the danger in not processing and addressing how you're feeling about the news is then you carry it over to when you're meeting with the client and may inadvertently impose your sentiments or inflect a certain intonation into how you're saying the news to the client. And that will make them feel even worse. So you want to prevent that. You want to make sure that you are all squared away within yourself on how am I feeling about this? Why am I feeling this way? What can I do to situate myself, to ground myself before I have this tough conversation with the client? And also to ensure that I'm not making them feel worse about it because, you're empathic and obviously you did what you could for the client, but things don't go always the way that you'd like them to go. And being very realistic with yourself initially will help you in the process of delivering the news to your client. So, once you've kind of taken an inventory of how you're feeling and kind of reacted and processed to the news yourself, then you want to evaluate. What am I expecting will be the reaction from the client? What questions might they have? Who else might be present? And when and where are we going to do this? Evaluating when you're going to be having this conversation and where and all the details really helps you to get into the mind frame of having that conversation and to be ready, because you don't want to go in there unprepared and unsure of what you're going to say, how you're going to say it. Planning, prepping, evaluating are all super helpful when prefacing the news, or even before you're prefacing the news to the client, when you're just preparing yourself for that interaction. And of course, concretely planning. Why do I have to tell this news to the client? What is the most important point of the news that I have to get across? Or by the end of the discussion, what is the one thing that they have to have understood for sure? Make it concise, specific, and clear. Again, you don't want to dilly dally, you don't want to go around, circumvent. Being direct, being to the point, having it very clearly written down for yourself. This is the news they must understand by the end of the meeting will be helpful to you in when you're game planning the conversation and then the follow up as well. So at this moment, you can also look at the little word bubble. Where can I apply this? Do I recall an interaction where this would have been helpful? So at this point, you may have already dealt with a few different client cases, and this might already be bringing up some memories or some interactions that you've had where you might have applied this, or it would have been helpful to apply something similar to this. So I encourage you to kind of delve into your memory, think about cases that you've worked on before, or maybe are actively working on at the moment. Where could you um, put this in the lineup of when you're having interactions with clients? Because having these steps are not only critical when delivering bad news, but when you're delivering news in general that may not be super pleasant or just interactions with the client. Planning, evaluating, and knowing within yourself how you're feeling about a certain interaction or certain news is helpful in communicating and facilitating that rapport between yourself and your client. So take a moment to kind of think about it. Where can I apply this? Where could I have applied this? So once you've prefaced and planned, now you want to move on to step two, which is the meatiest section of the process, which of course is breaking the news. So go straight to the point. What exactly is it that you need to communicate to your client? What is the bottom line? Again, you don't want to stall. You don't want to try explaining every little point. You want to make sure that you're saying this directly and clearly to the client in a way that they'll understand. So we have an example on the screen of some kind of lingo or some words that you could use depending on what the client case is and what the news is. It could sound something like, you recall how we argued this certain thing. Once the client has confirmed that they're on the same page, yes, I remember we discussed this was our plan or this was our goal, then you proceed into saying the judge or whoever it is, the agency did not accept our argument and they decided that we won't be able to XYZ, whatever it is. and then break that down very succinctly on what that means. Once the news has been delivered, you really want to take a moment to let the client process. So, a moment of silence, whatever it is, or if they need to ask questions immediately, let them have that moment to come to grips with what exactly you have just told them. Remember how you felt about the news. Remember how that's going to be exponentially greater for the client because it's directly impacting their life. So give them a moment to really process and understand what exactly it is that you've given to them in the news, in the, what the bottom line is regarding the client case that you've been working on with them. Once the news has been delivered, and it's important also to recognize that this point in the process will probably be the quickest. The most rapid section will be just the delivery of the news. So it'll be maybe a 15-second interaction. You're prefacing, you're explaining, and then boom, this is what it is. So you want to make sure that you have a moment in time where the client can process because it's going to be super quick and you don't want to rush into the further explanation of the decision before they've had a chance to really just sit with it for a minute. So once you've sat with it for a minute, you will proceed to step 3, which is explaining. So you want to tailor the explanation to the client case, to the person themselves as well, because different clients will react differently based on how many interactions as well you've had with the client, whether you've only interfaced with them one time or have had 5 meetings with them already. You'll kind of know how you should deliver the news. If a more formal way of explaining with more detail or less detail, you'll have to tailor this specifically to the way that you feel the client will understand in the best way possible. Throughout the explanation process, you want to remember, be empathic. Don't rush through it, but don't go around in circles. Be direct. Take pauses. Make sure that the client is understanding the statements that you're giving to them. And then also take the time to notice any expressions that they're making, any reactions that they're having, whether facial or verbal, because you want to make sure that you're on the same page in the steps of the process. So breaking this down a little bit more, once the news has been delivered, they've had their chance to kind of process it on their own. Maybe they've shared their initial questions with you. If this has not already come up, this is the opportunity that you take to say, would you like me to explain how the court reached this decision? If they're receptive to that, then move through it with them point by point. Start with what you had discussed with them prior, what you guys had goal planned together. This is to ensure, obviously, that you guys are on the same page, but also to remind the client on what are the things that you worked on together. What was your game plan that you came to together? To remember, this is a rapport that we built. We are on your team. This is what this is the argument that we use to go to bat for you. So again, make sure that they're with you point by point. You may not need to go into all the specifics if you've had a series of interactions with the client and they're very aware of what the argument or what the approach was. But again, the main points of what your strategy wouldn't be a bad idea to review if they are receptive to the explanation portion of this process. And again, be attentive to how they're reacting to the news or the facial expressions that they're having as well while you're explaining the different things. Moving on to part 2 of the explanation, then you'll explain a little bit about what the opposing side's argument was. This is what they said, this is what they argued to counter the points that we made. Again, pause, make sure that they're following along, and that you're trying to explain things as clearly and directly as possible so that the client is not feeling lost, or as well that they're not feeling unheard, or that they don't feel free to ask questions on, well, why did they say this and why didn't we do this? Make sure that they have the time to respond if they're not quite grasping the things that you're telling them. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're on the same page. This is the result. Again, this is the news that we were given. This is the decision that the judge came to. Is it clear? Do you have any questions based on what we just discussed? And if applicable, because in the beginning we said don't sugarcoat, don't make promises that you can't keep, but if there is some flexibility, if there is some way that you think there may be a way to mitigate or address the judge's ruling or whatever it was, this is also the moment to say, hey, we believe that there are some steps we could take that would make the situation a little bit better. Would it be okay if we discuss that now? If it's just too much for the client to handle, then of course you want to reschedule. You want to schedule for a time where they've had the time to process, because obviously in the moment they're processing, but they'll probably need more time versus just that meeting that you guys are having. So if there are other steps and they're receptive to hearing them, this is a great moment to say, hey, when we were initially talking, I did briefly mention there might be something that we can do. Can we talk about that now, or do you want to reschedule? And again, tailor the language to your client. How do you feel that they're going to be most receptive to what you're telling to them? And don't pressure them one way or another, because again, we want to make sure that they're making this decision of their own free will, and that they are still feeling that there's a good partnership between the two of you, and not feeling like you didn't go to bat for them or feeling that you didn't do what you could. So the explanation part concludes really the process of breaking the bad news to your client. However, there are some nuances depending on who the client is, what situation they're in, what struggles they're facing outside of just the legal issue that they've presented to you with. So now we'll look a little bit closer at specifically two particular context. If a client is dealing with a mental health concern, or if they have in general difficulty processing or with emotional regulation, these are two scenarios that we can dig a little bit deeper into, because it can get a little bit more complicated and won't be so cut and dry. And you want to be sure to address each as best you can, respectfully, but also directly, and not sugarcoating again. So with those experiencing mental illness, if a client is experiencing delusions or hallucinations, that of course is their reality. Trying to address that on top of breaking the bad news will not be helpful to anyone in the situation. So, if for example somebody is responding to an external stimuli, talking to Bobby's not in the room, and you know that it's a delusion or a hallucination, you can communicate very clearly. Hey, I know that you're talking to Bobby right now, or I know that you think the government is trying to track you down, but listen, I think it's really important that we also talk about this important thing about your case that we discussed last week or 2 weeks ago, because there has been a super important update. If you don't think this is a good time, then we can reschedule. And you let me know what you think would be best. So again, it's not pretending to know what it means for them to be experiencing their delusions or their hallucinations, but it's also not ignoring it, because it is a very real presence that they may be witnessing, that they may be experiencing, and you don't want to act like, they're crazy, or they don't know what they're talking about, they don't know who they're talking to. You may not see it, but it is their reality. So while you can't pretend to know what they're experiencing, you can understand and communicate, hey, I know that you're seeing this, I know that you're hearing this. There is something that we actually need to discuss, though, in this moment, if that's okay with you. And then, of course, remember, they have the agency to say yes, no, this is a good moment, or not, and then move along. It's also important to remember that people experiencing paranoia may need, just in general, more space and time. So be very attentive, and this is good to know with clients that are experiencing more serious mental health concerns, or even those without. How close are you to the client? Are you guys sitting? Are you standing? What is the wording? Are you taking the pause to ensure that the client is receptive or understanding of the different points that you're making while you guys are talking? So make sure that you're taking the moment to look at the situation, and am I doing this appropriately? Is this a good spot for them to sit? Would you like to sit with your back towards the door? Would you like water? Make sure that you're being empathic, compassionate, and just very attentive to the needs of the client as you're having this important conversation. And again, Be clear, concise, give them time to process. This is also a good moment for you all to think about where this has been relevant for you in the past with a client case. Have you faced this before? How did you handle that situation? What did you do? What did you say? Do you feel that it could have gone better? In what way? So take just a moment to reflect on if you've had a certain client case where there was a client that was actively dealing with um, symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, or responding to stimuli that were out of their control, out of your control. How did you deal with the situation before, um, and how do you think you could have done better if that is relevant to that experience? Self-determination is also super important when working with clients who are dealing with these issues, because just because they have mental health diagnoses or are struggling with certain things doesn't mean that they have diminished competence or just are unable to understand what you're saying. So remember to treat people with respect, with empathy, be very direct, but remember the precariousness of their condition. Remember that they don't always have control of what they're going to hear, what they're going to see, and that doesn't diminish their capacity to understand, but it can interfere with the process of how you interact with them, the time, the space, all of that. And remember the right to autonomy. You're there to you're there to provide a service. You're there obviously to support them. You want them to reach the goal. You want them to be better on the other end. Sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes they just may not receive the help in a way that you think they should. So we can't make decisions for them. We can only offer the support in the best way that you know. And if they don't want it, if at any point they decide, you know what, no, I don't think you did a good job, I'd rather not work with you anymore, don't take it as a personal affront, because remember, it's autonomy, it's self-determination. You put in the work, you did what you could, and some people, that is their way of coping, that is their way of processing. We can't force people to change their nature. So it's important to be aware that, it's not your fault that they are, lashing out of anger, out of sadness, because dealing with bad news is tough for everyone. Everyone accepts it and processes it in their own way. So just be sure that, they understand what you guys have worked on. This is the update. Make sure that they are the ones making the decision on how they want to proceed or not proceed. Regardless of what their mental health issues are, you want to make sure. I know that they have the capacity, unless they have, obviously that's a different scenario, they've been deemed incompetent or whatever it is, that they can't actually make those decisions. But in most situations, if you are working one-on-one with a client, they still have the capacity to make decisions for themselves. So be respectful, be honest, be direct, and make sure that you're not swaying them one way or another on where they want to go with the next steps. Safety is always a good thing to remember, especially when you're trying to set up a meeting on, you know, giving them an update or breaking some bad news. Make sure you're very communicative with them. We established that we're going to meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. Does that still work for you? If not, when would be a good time? Sooner would be better than later, just because this update is very important to your case. Meet in a place that's accessible to them, safe to everyone, of course. Think about safety planning if necessary, especially if you have a client that's often symptomatic, who may need an advocate or a therapist that they can call during the appointment if necessary. See what they prefer and say, hey, listen, I know that in the past we've discussed certain things and this has happened, or you've reacted this way, or this is what you said. Do you think, would it be helpful to you if your advocate is present? Would it be helpful to you if we take a pause so you can touch base with your therapist? Things like that. Think outside the box if necessary, especially in those cases where a client may be a little bit more high needs. And then, of course, if a client is demonstrating aggression, or if you expect that they may, uh, you know, experience a more violent or aggressive response to what you're telling them, again, make sure you have a plan in place. If you have to end the visit, not just for your own safety, but for theirs as well, because you don't want to escalate it to a point where there's the point of no return. So essentially, if somebody is raising their voice to a very aggressive tone, if they're using certain language, if they seem to start getting more physically aggressive, maybe not putting their hands on you, but standing up or throwing chairs, things like that, you want to make sure to not ignore that. Say very clearly, listen, I see that you are reacting this way. I see that the news is, unfortunately causing you maybe to feel overwhelmed, that you're expressing some anger, some frustration, some sadness. I want to make sure that this continues to be a safe meeting for the both of us. I think at this point in time, it would be best for us to reschedule and then proceed. It's based on what's going on in that moment, depending on how the client reacts. Um, but skirting around the issue or ignoring it is never helpful because one, it might just cause them to continue to behaving in that way, and two, it puts you in a more risky situation. So you want to be clear. Look, this is what's happening. I don't think it's in our best interest to continue at this moment in time. However, this is a super important thing that we should discuss for your case. When can we meet again? And then proceed from there. And then besides the clients that are actively experiencing hallucinations, illusions, they have very serious mental health diagnoses, there may just be clients that are unable to really emotionally regulate based on the seriousness of the news that you're delivering to them. So with those clients that are experiencing a little bit more difficulty, don't freak out. Remember, emotions are a normal part of the human existence, You know how you reacted to the news. You can kind of expect if they're going to freak out, if they're going to feel overwhelmed. Knowing on the subject matter what the decision is, what the actual news is, you can kind of expect what the reaction of the client will be. So, with that in mind, just prepare yourself also to the possible emotional reaction of the client. Again, don't assume that they're not intelligent or that they don't understand what you're saying. If you're meeting in person with them, speak plainly, speak directly, speak honestly, be respectful, make eye contact. Remember to listen attentively and to watch, see how their pose is, how their facial expression is. Even if they're not saying something out loud to you, their facial expression or their manner of sitting or standing may communicate to you something, that something's not sitting well with them, that they're confused, that they're sad. And if that is the case and they're not willing to discuss or talk, it's okay to sit in silence, but if you feel that the conversation needs to be had because it's critical to moving forward and they haven't decided that they want to end communication completely, you can address it directly, very kindly, empathically say, hey, I notice that you are experiencing some sadness. I notice that you're crying. I notice that you seem upset. I want to help. I want to make sure that we're doing this in the best way possible so that we can achieve the goal that we established together for you, for your family, for whoever it is. What would make this better? How can I support you better? And then it's also super helpful to offer a break at whatever point that it is, especially once the news has been delivered after you've explained a little bit more, and you've addressed maybe their reaction, whatever it is. Do we need a break? Do you need a break? Do you need a glass of water? Do we just need to take a moment to pause, to process? And again, let the client take the lead on this. They will know best based on how they're um, emotionally reacting, based on what they're thinking, based on how they're processing in the moment to what you've said. At this time, it's also important for you, again, to reflect, where can I apply this? Where in my previous experiences could this come in handy, or could this have come in handy, or where could I have used this? Or where can I use this now? Where can I expect to use this in a present case? So that is all for this training today. There are some references on the screen where some of this information was taken from. Please feel free to visit these web pages to get more information on this super important topic of breaking bad news to your client in a legal clinic setting. Remember, you want to evaluate for yourself, preface the news with the client, break the news very directly to them, and then explain in a way that they would be most receptive to it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I wish you all the best in your upcoming cases and semesters.